Passiamo allora all'ultimo intervento prima della discussione. È il dottor Ynon Wygoda dell'Università Ebraica di Tel Aviv, che presenta un intervento dal titolo The Uniqueness of Rosenzweig's Reception in Palestine in 1936 and 1946.
I would like to begin by thanking the organizers, both from the Gregoriana and the Sapienza, both faculties, both, I presume, many workers who have labored to create this wonderful conference, which seems to be quite promising, and I am quite grateful, I'm sure, on the part of many of us. I would also like to excuse myself for trying to fill large shoes that are definitely too large for my stature. That is, Professor Christian Wiese was sadly taken ill and could not have come, and therefore I was asked by Professor Ynon to try to give the talk instead of him, and I hope that I could at least commence a discussion in a place where more definitive statements might have been made. In a letter written by Gershom Scholem to Martin Buber on 27th of February 1930, Scholem wrote, "The day may come when people will study and discuss the book as they do the guide for the perplexed. As we approach the centennial anniversary of the composition of the Star of Redemption, one may well argue that that day has arrived. It is time that we also look at the reception of the book, at the manner in which this modern-day classic was read, just as ancient classics are read not only in their content, but in the manner in which traditions have read them. That is to say, we are to view the text not only in what they contributed to their own time and place, reverberating what Professor Gibbs had said earlier, but the manner in which they continued to entice the readers to reflect through their pages upon their own situations. What is more, it is arguably the very definition of a classic that it is never one that has already been read, but rather one which is always re-read. And perhaps it is important that we therefore pinpoint the manners and different manners in which those rereadings took place. And if we take the analogy with the Guide for the Perplexed seriously, just as we have a rationalistic Maimonides, a mystical Maimonides, a halachic Maimonides, so too, perhaps we could have various readings of Rosenzweig as well. But when we think of rereadings, we could think of them as genres, in a taxonomy of genres, as now mentioned regarding Maimonides. One could also make the taxonomy according to place and language. And that is what I suggest to do here today, trying to take one example, that of the early reception of Rosenzweig in Palestine, as a larger claim that Rosenzweig is to be seen differently according to the various readings he received in Germany, Israel, the Anglo-Saxon world, the French world, possibly also the Italian world, and beyond, with which I am not familiar. The example I would like to focus on more specifically is the case of the reception of Rosenzweig in an early meeting that took place in the Zalman Shoken Library, the famous Mycenas of Jewish studies in pre-state Palestine. And what went on there became a very fruitful, vibrant discussion that was the first to try to think, what does Rosenzweig say to us here today? Oddly enough, though most speakers are all of German descent, all would have preferred to speak German, the entire discussion took place in Hebrew, and as we shall see, they all asked, what does he say to us, supposedly not us who grew up with him or knowing him or reading him in the original, but us in the larger first-person plural, which is the young nascent nation that wishes to think of itself through Rosenzweig. Okay. In this first welcoming words, Zalman Shokin said the following. On 25th of December, 1936, some 7 years, if you will, to Rosenzweig's passing, or almost 50 years to his date of birth. Although the final arrangements in this house have not been completed, we thought that the date that marks Rosenzweig's passing is an appropriate occasion with which we may begin our work here. I hope that this celebration, Mesiba, will serve as a symbol for the work that we will undertake in this place. And indeed, in this famed institution built by the renowned architect Erich Mendelsohn, Shokin envisaged a library that would also function as a place of study and research, and he called these scientific celebrations Mesibot Madayot, which sounds as strange in English as it does in Hebrew. What is interesting is that these early meetings several of them took place, are now found to perhaps encapsulate early thinking of key figures such as the discussion I will present to you today, but others, such as perhaps the very earliest formulations of Gershom Scholem's, the kern of his book on Shabtai Tzvi, might have been formulated in one of these scientific meetings as well, such as the archive at the Zalman Shokin library is truly still an undiscovered richness that still seeks its readers. The person who led the discussion was Akiva Ernst Simon. And Simon begins by asking the following question. We ask, what did Franz Rosenzweig bequeath to us? What is his spiritual heritage? We have the right and the place to ask this question, particularly in what concerns this thinker, since perhaps no other thinker emphasized the veritable value of the temporal within philosophy and for the philosophical truth. He declared time and again that there exists no ethereal truth, but rather that every truth is relevant for a specific time, a specific epoch, that is to say, for a specific society at a specific time. That is why it is not only our full right, but our duty to ask what is in truth Franz Rosenzweig's truth for our times and our settlement here. And again, reverberations of Professor Gibbs's first talk. What can a thinker who wrote his book in a German that is, in my opinion, untranslatable into Hebrew, award us who live in the land of Zion? This question, what did Franz Rosenzweig bequeath to us, was actually already asked by the very first public dealing with Rosenzweig, which was Gershom Scholem's famed eulogy 30 days after the passing of his friend at the Hebrew University, at the bottom of your screen, in which he asks, oddly enough missing from the English translation, Franz Rosenzweig passed away. He was almost 43 when he died. The question is, how and why does his life matter to us? Ma lanu velo. The Hebrew actually is more poignant. What do we have anything to do with him? What can he have any relevance to us whatsoever? Simon would further accentuate the problem. And so he says, when we observe what is taking place among German Jewry today, we see a certain Protestant pietism that adorns itself with select citation from Rosenzweig's writings by people who never delved into the depth of his thought and who defend their insistence on remaining in exile or even their hate of Zion with these citations. We observe many negative results, next to some positive ones, as a result of this philosophy. This fact forces us further to ask what is the relevance of Rosenzweig's thought to us here in Palestine. So, Simon would actually go on to ask not only in the general matter, but in a critical manner. We students and collaborators of Rosenzweig who have moved here to Israel, how are we to appropriate this doctrine, this philosophy that is lost back in Germany on people who use it rather than want to think through it? So Simon. So not necessarily the truth by any means, but so Simon. Hence, you see the problem in the manner in which these thinkers moved to Palestine have while treating this thinker. On the one hand, they see themselves as the redeemers of this philosophy. Scholem would cite Simon's idea, possibly given from Rosenzweig, possibly his own, that the Hebrew translation of the star is to be the salvaging of this text that otherwise will be misread by other readers. And on the other hand, what he's looking for is a manner to somehow square a philosophy that doesn't necessarily meet by any means a Zionist, a Hebrew, a national framework with its own premises. Okay. Several questions are posed in this discussion, and I will mention them very briefly. They are perhaps to the number of 5. The first is perhaps the most striking of the manner in which Rosenzweig, the problem readers of Rosenzweig found in Israel. And that is, again, from Simon, once I heard from a young scholar whose Jewish scholarship was gained in Lithuania and his academic formation was earned in Germany, perfect pedigree, that when he read Rosenzweig, he felt he is reading a goy who studied Torah. And this description left a tremendous impression on me, and I cannot free myself from it. It is perhaps true in many respects, as Rosenzweig was a goy who studied Torah. But this weakness was his strength. This goy saw things that we did not. Let me accentuate the problem. The phrase, a goy who studied Torah, is not one without tremendous weight. In 2 places in the Talmud, one in Tractate Chagiga and one in Tractate Avodah Zarah, the question is debated between the rabbis, is a goy, a non-Jew, a heathen, possibly an idolater, who studies Torah equal to the highest priest, or is a goy who studied Torah one who is supposed to be barred, possibly even put to death? The question is that to use such a statement is one of tremendous weight. But let me explain what I think is meant behind these words. What is meant is Rosenzweig does certainly show tremendous scholarship in his writings. However, that scholarship is so idiosyncratic in its nature that he seems to be lacking a tremendous background in the actual tradition of traditional Jewish learning. As one Rosenzweig scholar once said, one should never underestimate the ameratzus of Rosenzweig. One should never underestimate the lack of knowledge of traditional. However, at the same time, say these very critics, perhaps his disadvantage is his advantage. Why? Because precisely regaining access, wishing to gain access to these traditional texts with foreign eyes enables him to do things that a traditionalist can never do. Hence, these scholars in Palestine ask themselves, this was all good and well when taught to people who knew little, but us here, can this still have meaning? And the answer is, possibly, perhaps his disadvantage is his greatest advantage. He could teach us things that we cannot see by ourselves. Let us learn from him. So this is the first point. The second point is the Jewish-Christian relationship. Ask, the 4 who are there are Simon, Julius Gutmann, Shmuel Hugo Bergman, and Gershom Scholem. And they ask, is this accentuated place, critical place, within the larger architecture of Rosenzweig's philosophy allotted to Christianity, one that could have meaning to the youth here in Israel that have absolutely nothing to do with Christianity or very little to do with Christians, for that matter? Does that element, which plays such a central role for the man, Franz Rosenzweig, keep its importance in the philosophy, Franz Rosenzweig's, to the youth here today? Bergman would even stress the question further, and he would ask, is it not time to ask Rosenzweig, how can one straddle at one and the same time the question of the not yet and the already of the end of time? Should one, a question that was of such importance to the early Zionists, where are we on the line of history? So that is the second element. The third is the question of the familiarity or importance with the idealist and romantic German traditions. The four would say, our youth know nothing of this, nor is this perhaps still the burning question for them today. The question is not only one of scholarship, rather, as Simon would say, it is also because of the strange mix that is the young Zionist movement, which is, its problem seems to be a strange mixture of enlightenment and nationalism, by which I think he means their question is not how the individual could face the totality of a system. Their question is the question of the Enlightenment in as far as they seek equality, and it is one of nationalism in as much as they seek their particularity. Both stress the collective, not the question of the individual versus a system. How then, in a society which asks itself such questions, could Rosenzweig's philosophy still be of meaning? Fourthly, and only fourthly, comes the question of Zionism. Rosenzweig's renowned criticism of Zionism, that with which his readers abroad adorn themselves, supposedly. Here too, interestingly, it is not so much the problem of Rosenzweig as a critic of Zionism, but rather it is more one which interests them in must, possibly, Rosenzweig's system be aligned with an anti-Zionist stance, or could it be in accordance with it? More importantly, perhaps, Scholem would ask three intriguing questions. The one is whether Rosenzweig truly is to be seen as an anti-Zionist, or rather is he to be seen as the first post-Zionist, in as far as his system is not an antithesis to Zionism, it is rather one which tries to place itself in a manner that even if Zionism were accomplished, his system would still be of importance. A fascinating thought which I cannot develop here now. The second is what Scholem would call Rosenzweig's problem of his very particular interpretation of the end of days or of redemption. Rosenzweig, says Scholem, detested those yearning for the end of times, the apocalyptical, those whose notion of the end of days and of redemption underline the catastrophical element of redemption. This anti-apocalyptical side expressed itself in Rosenzweig's writings in the will to escape a messianism that entails the depth of the apocalypse. Meaning, Rosenzweig's reading of redemption is one that already supposes an existing glimmer of it and takes away the possibility of the future remaining as a future, also taking away from it the apocalypse that is the second side of that future. Lastly, what is fascinating about Scholem's reaction is that he would ask, is Rosenzweig's philosophy the one that is to be at the use of the youth in Israel because of its all too ready religious standpoint, its premise that there is a summoning of God to man with man, whom man could hear. Do we not need a thinker who starts from a mute God? Hence, when asked after his talk, who could that thinker be? Scholem says, perhaps the theologian we should turn to here and now is Kafka rather than Rosenzweig. If all this was the negative and possibly some of the positive, in the manner in which Rosenzweig was accepted in Israel, or pre-state Israel, what is almost as interesting is the manner in which his translation project was rooted in a land that prided itself on a return to Hebrew as an everyday language and a detachment from exilic Jewry. From the very beginning of the Buber Rosenzweig project, the question whether the project itself is of note and necessity is famed and perhaps best formulated in Immanuel Ben-Gurion, Micha Berdichevsky's son and famed author on his own right, who wrote that several years ago, the new translation of the Bible by Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig began to appear, and it quickly gained a certain prominence. The endeavor had gained enthusiastic supporters almost unanimously, if one was to take the voice of the press as the voice of the people. We must first clarify that a translation of the Bible actually means and how one reads the Bible. Let me skip down. The original old text of the Bible, for those who are familiar with it, is irreplaceable by any translation. He who wishes to experience the poetic power of the Bible in German, he who wishes to enliven himself with the source of religion through its words, he who seeks edification and instruction, for such a man, Luther already translated the Bible. Hence, there is simply no need. If you think these voices were heard in Germany, you might very well understand how these voices were heard in Israel, in which the thought was, we certainly no longer need any translation, definitely not one that makes its stake in an innovative German formulation. But what is perhaps even more interesting to note is that for some, the project of translation was Rosenzweig's main endeavor. That was his greatest achievement. This is from the eulogy after Rosenzweig's passing for the most circulated newspaper in Yiddish in Poland, Der Heint. And in the highlighted section, you have das Lebenswerk von Franz Rosenzweig in seiner Übersetzung von Tanach, zusammen mit Martin Buber, etc., etc. That's it. There's not a single mentioning of the Star of Redemption or any other philosophical work in the entire eulogy. His greatest contribution was the translation. Hence, when it came to Israel, not only was it a question of not German, it was a question of this was a diasporic endeavor from which and for which we, those living in the land of the Hebrew speakers, have no need whatsoever. All the more so when we have statements such as Ben-Gurion's, our right to Palestine derives not from the mandate of the Balfour Declaration, it precedes them. The Bible is our mandate. The Bible which was written by us in our Hebrew language and in this very land that is our mandate. Okay. Let me skip a few down. What is, I think, of fascination is the fact that, contrary to what one might think, there was a person who took on this particular translation as contributive and actually of tremendous educational importance to those speaking Hebrew in the land of Israel. And to understand that, I would like to read just a short passage by Simon again, and then to unveil who that person is. Even the Hebrew reader, this is from the celebration when Buber finally finished in the early 60s, the translation. Even the Hebrew reader of the 20th century, says Simon, is to a large extent a product of Western culture, who also requires a bridge so as to overcome the cleft between his own perception of the world and that of the old text. Precisely the everyday use of Hebrew language can become an obstacle and a hindrance when it obfuscates, or obliterates the particularity of the Hebrew of the Bible. We could therefore use the bridge built by Buber Rosenzweig in an inverted direction through our alienation, Entfernung. Via the German vocabulary, we shall free ourselves from the seeming vicinity to the old text and will enable us to see it in its proper perspective, in its uniqueness. Hence, what Simon is claiming, you Hebrew speakers, you children of doctrines of Ben-Gurion, you who think you have an immediate access to the text, perhaps you, most of all, need translations to understand that text you claim is your very mandate of existence. And the person who took on that challenge is Nechama Leibovich. Nechama Leibovich, sister of famed philosopher, moralist, thinker Yeshayahu Leibovich, tremendous biblical scholar in her own right. Leibovich, who, as she would write in her doctoral thesis on the question of translation, was a Jewess who was born in Riga, moved to Berlin, studied at the university and in the various Batei Midrash of the time, the Hochschule für Wissenschaft des Judentums, etc., began a project that was of unbelievable educational significance. And this project are these pages that you see before you here. These are called the Gilionot in Hebrew, or the stencils. These were questions on the Torah readings portions of the week, mentioned just now by Professor Meir. And they were published from 1941 to 1971. It was a one-woman educational popular university. She would send these questions to whoever asked for them. They would answer back. She would comment on their answers and send back the questions in red ink, what was wrong. And what is fascinating is that people who participated in this project were both laymen, laywomen, as well as professors and educators of quite significant knowledge. We have, for example, in the Hugo Bergman archives, 4 years in which every week he writes back to Nechama, she writes back to him on what he wrote wrong in his answers on the questions of the week. Now, what is fascinating about this project is that as part of it, she would regularly make mention of the Buber Rosenzweig translation. However, as far as I could tell, with a certain difference. Before 1945, she would always write to those who speak a foreign language, cite the verse, cite Mendelssohn in this case, Hirsch, and then Buber Rosenzweig, all in Hebrew transliteration. After 1945, all of a sudden you have the same citations, but in the original German. Think about this. At the moment in which German is most anathema to the readers of Hebrew, she, unquestionable professor of the very book they claim to, makes the claim that we need to read the German in order to understand what the Book of Book has to say to us today. As such, I think that what is fascinating is that precisely she makes good on the promise of Buber Rosenzweig in Die Verdeutschung ihrer Schrift, that only through a second language, only in the bridge between the two languages can ultimately the text come about. And if those who think they have appropriated a language, if you remember, that is the very danger Rosenzweig warns us in the third part of The Star, they particularly perhaps require a translation, perhaps in the language that is most foreign to them, so that they would have no will to appropriate it as their own, but keep it as estranged. As such, I believe Nechama has the added contribution to perhaps also continue one of Rosenzweig's greatest achievements. We spoke of his philosophy and we spoke of his translation. there is a third element here, that is his educational endeavors. And true to that as well, this is Nechama's comments to Martin Buber on his translation later on. Your first translation was slightly better than your second because it aligns with a certain tradition of texts, which Buber turned to her as an expert, which he wasn't necessarily, but she would turn to him as an expert of the German language, which she wasn't necessarily, though both were experts in every meaning of the term in alternate disciplines. When Nechama asked that she would be buried, she asked that she be buried under a sigil title, teacher. Notice one thing that is missing throughout this early reception, and I think this is already what I would like to perhaps throw as an open remark. What is missing here is the man Rosenzweig, is the story of his return. Bergman, in his earliest writing on Rosenzweig, would say, I have no interest in the man, I want to think only of the doctrine. Nachum Glotzer, who would first write in Yiddish, then in Hebrew, and only then in the extremely influential version in English, would do the opposite. The influence of what sort of Rosenzweig we read, we perceive, we think of, is different, so I would claim. In the different languages it is read by, the different traditions he is aligned with, and ultimately the different translations he's translated into. And I'll end with this remark. In the early 2000s, there was a conference, which I presume some of you were present here today, participated in, called Rosenzweig als Leser. And in that conference, readers of the proceedings of the conference will be right away struck by the fact that most scholars coming from Germany took the title to mean Rosenzweig als Leser of German idealism and romanticism. Practically all Israeli scholars who came to that question took it to mean Rosenzweig als Leser of Jewish sources. What is fascinating is that at times they could both refer to the very same verse, passage, formulation in the Star of Redemption, the ones aligning it with the book of Job, the others saying it's taken from Schopenhauer. The two aren't necessarily contradictory. Schopenhauer could have very well thought of the book of Job. But what is more important is the fact that ultimately each reading thinks through its own tradition, and the resulting Rosenzweig is different. My call, perhaps, is that it is time for us to start thinking not only of the book, but also of its reception. Thank you.
Grazie, abbiamo un po' di tempo, direi un quarto d'ora per cominciare a raccogliere alcune domande, sviluppare un primo germe di discussione che poi sarà possibile continuare nei prossimi giorni. Allora appunto possiamo eventualmente raccogliere qualche domanda. Non so se abbiamo un microfono che può essere... ok. Ecco, abbiamo un primo intervento lì, in alto.
Thank you. A small question to Ynon, to the last speaker. The other thing that struck me that seemed not to be discussed in the party, the Nocturnal Party of 36, is National Socialism. At least it seemed to me that it would have been an obvious question at this time. There today, referring to Rosenzweig, who represents, of course, a very specific diaspora, who is, at these very moments, is being dissolved and beginning a destruction. And I wonder if nobody raised the question, and to what extent this absence of discussion could be connected to the absence of discussion of the person, Rosenzweig.
Yes, it's better if you answer.
Okay, so thank you for the question. As far as I know, from the minutes recorded in the archives, there is no mentioning of whatsoever. Along with Enrico Luca, we hope to publish the entirety of those proceedings this coming fall. But I agree that it's a striking question, and yet it is also somewhat typical of the scientific element of these scientific celebrations. They remain concentrated on the question at hand and try to remain aloof to the larger political standpoint with which some of the members are actually very well involved. Scholem, Simon, certainly Bergman. And so I think it is telling more of the place rather than of the fact that this is noticeably missing. But I agree that it's a fascinating question that has to be seen alongside their letters, their other writings, their political activities, and then one could speak of an actual silence over this particular place. Unlike the man, for the man, they all realize that there is the possibility. The fact that Bergman has to start by saying, I do not want to turn to the man, is telling of the fact that he is quite well aware that the myth Rosenzweig has already exploded. And so I think it is of fascinating note that they choose what to talk to and what not to talk about.
Abbiamo prima una domanda, prego, poi là e poi...
Okay. Thank you for these 3 insightful lectures. I have a question for Professor Meir, and I want to play the role of Anderson Boy, who cries, the king is naked. Can we really base a philosophy of interreligious dialogue on the star when we see how Rosenzweig treats Islam, and even in what relating to Christianity? Let's put aside Leora Batnitsky claim that Rosenzweig does not legitimize Christianity. But even if he does, I think that he builds a scheme, a Jewish scheme, in which Christianity has an important role. But does he see Christianity from a Christian perspective? And without doing so, can we really generate a real dialogue between religions?
When I prepared my speech, I was thinking about our present situation, in which there is a radicalization of religions. And I published a book in 2015 on interreligious theology, which was translated also in German the year after, meaning in 16. And I refer to Rosenzweig as one of the pioneers of interreligious theology, although it is easy to criticize Rosenzweig, and I do it also because I think he, as we know, he inherited Hegel's thought on Islam, and he also used the Eastern religions as a category. So that's not the way one has to work in interreligious or dialogical theology, but the end is fascinating me. The end is a way of starting thinking at that early time, which can be enlarged to other religions. I'm not remaining with Rosenzweig. I get from him some inspiration for the construction of a dialogical theology. And I think we will earn a lot if religions as communities not only start to understand each other, but to interact with each other. Because then we are diminishing an exclusivist attitude, and we are promoting a kind of thinking which I would say promotes what Bob said, a plural modes of redemption. So the question is, if Rosenzweig, my question mainly is, if we can enlarge this Jewish saying of the Elu Elu Divrei Elohim Chaim, these and that are the words of the living God, not only to different opinions within Judaism, but to different opinions about the ultimate reality, which is, to say it very profanely, it's a thing an sich, which we can't reach. But we organize ourselves in different communities around that idea of the ultimate reality. And it would be a mistake, I think, not to learn from others, as Rosenzweig did. Rosenzweig said that, a little bit like Bober also, at last page of zwei Glaubensweisen, two ways of faith, he said Christians can learn from Jews what is community, and Jews can learn from Christians what is the individual. Something similar we have in the third part of the star. So there is a kind of learning from each other, being in the leerhouse of different religions. So that would be my answer. It's a start for me. It's not the end. It's just acknowledging that he contributed to a dialogical thinking by the word end. My entire project is to enlarge it.
We have a question on this side.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to congratulate Ynon on this wonderful lecture, because I think it shows the kind of next generation of Rosenzweig's reception. I am of that age that I still knew Rosenzweig, and I knew Bergman, and I knew Uriel Simon and Scholem, and I had talks with him. They were talking Hebrew, but they were thinking in German. Okay, their translations, you know, that's why it's very hard to read their translations into Hebrew. Now, my question to you actually is the following now. We know that Jews have always lived in two languages, whether it was Hebrew and Aramaic, or whether it was Yiddish Mameloshen. And it's still like that if you go to Meir Sharim. So we have on the one hand, the state of Israel, or that means the Israel going back to Zion, was Eliezer ben Yehuda, the renewal of the Hebrew language. And how do you renew the Hebrew language? You go back to the Bible. And that was also, of course, the Buber Rosenzweig translation was they went back to the root, to the Hebrew root. That's why it's so hard to understand their German. Now, my question is the following. In which way do we now understand Rosenzweig that for him, the language of liturgy was indeed Hebrew? That's why he said, you know, in the Lehrhaus, first people have to learn not the grammar, but they have to learn how to say Shema Yisrael. They have to learn how to pray. And then they have another language. So the whole tension between using Hebrew as a profane language, and this was the project of the Zionists, or as a holy tongue, this tension that's in there, and I think that has a lot to do with the ambiguities we see in this whole discussion. The ambiguity of, and Wissenschaft des Judentums, of course, if you read the Galut of Beer, you also see that. Do we have a new Wissenschaft? A Wissenschaft that we now use a Hebrew language, which is not the holy tongue or the word of God, but we use actually a language. And I think here we can think further, exactly on this question, what does it mean to speak in two languages and this kind of translation, the inner translation, and the whole question of Hebrew as a profane language and Hebrew as a holy tongue. The same thing, of course, you can say for Catholics, Latin and Italian, which is, okay. I think, not such a bad example.
Thank you.
Thinking of it. Thank you.
Okay, so I think that on this point, Rosenzweig actually, sorry, I think that on this point, Rosenzweig actually, knowingly or unknowingly, takes back or takes up a traditional standpoint that could be seen already from the figure of Ezra, the scribe, in the 8th chapter of the book of Nehemiah, and Maimonides, and I'll explain what I mean. In the 8th chapter of the book of Nehemiah, we have the story of Ezra and the people rediscovering the Torah that they've forgotten and they no longer understand. And Ezra reconstitutes a Sinai-like stage, at the top of which we have the reader and what seems mefarash v'sum sechel, possibly people translating or explaining that which is spoken in a language they do not understand. Ever since then, we have the idea that the Torah must be read in Hebrew and must simultaneously have a translation, halachically now, that should never be written down, that should always be renewed, appropriated for a specific time, a specific community, and the reader of that translation must be aligned physically. So Maimonides and his laws of the reading of the Torah, they should stand at the same platform, speak of the same voice, etc., etc. They are of equal standing. One is a language that is not understood yet spoken to the people. The other is a language that is spoken to the people but should never be written down. I think that in that sense, Rosenzweig's idea of a translation that salvages the Hebrew, that should be a language that should not be usable ever, is one that is traditional in its essence. And as such, I think that he's aligning himself here with a tradition that is claiming that the Word of God precisely retains its vivacity through the fact that it cannot be used, which, by the way, aligns with a modernist question of the usability of language as part of its contributing to its jaded nature. I think that's my answer. My answer is that Rosenzweig claims that is still the case, forever shall be the case, and should be the case. And I think what perhaps is lost is that you'd have to convince people to turn to a different language in order to retain that element. The halacha says each person is supposed to hear the Torah and read it with two translations in preparation for the weekly portions. How many Jews keep that halacha